During the early months of 1945, it was clear to most that the writing was on the wall for the Third Reich, falling massively short of the proposed 1,000 years it was to last. As the Allied forces encircled the country, there were many within the Nazi leadership who realized there was little that could be done. Yet, the most rabid and devoted to the Führer clung to the hope that they may prevail. In today's video, we will be covering the last few weeks of the Nazi regime, how the Allied forces closed in, and the fate that fell upon the German citizens caught up in the last few days of the war in Europe. By December of 1945, Allied forces in both the West and the East had made major gains. In the West, the British, American and Canadian forces had landed successfully in Normandy, liberating much of France and Belgium. In the East, the Red Army had made gains in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Some in the German High Command, such as Hermann Göring, wanted to sue for peace, though no such suggestion could be tolerated by Hitler. The Nazi leadership saw glimmers of hope seen in both the early successes experienced by the German forces in the Battle of the Bulge and in the death of President Franklin Roosevelt. But soon enough, it became apparent that the United States would continue without FDR, and that the Western Front would fall, beset by both the West and the East. It became clear that Germany would lose the war. This, however, did not stop Hitler from believing that some miracle would save his Reich, often fabricating entire divisions that would arrive to rescue the war, or that the Luftwaffe was strong enough to put an end to the Allied air superiority. But by January of 1945, the Allied forces had complete control of the skies over Germany. Berlin was at the mercy of Allied bombing. In 1944, the RAF had dropped over 500,000 tons of ordnance over Germany. But for Hitler and his cadre of most fanatical loyalists deep under the Reich Chancellery, there was still hope that the war could be won. Some leading Nazis secretly attempted to save their own skin, notably the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, attempting to negotiate a surrender. Meanwhile, Hitler's scorched earth policies sought to destroy Germany, one final punishment to the German people who Hitler believed had betrayed his vision. When the Soviet army reached the capital Berlin, the Nazi forces threw what soldiers they had to stem the red tide. Young boys of the Hitler Youth and old men were conscripted or brainwashed into being cannon fodder. Children armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons were thrown into the grinder, but it would never be enough. Berlin was encircled and subjected to a relentless artillery barrage. The Soviets would take Berlin no matter the cost. Some 80,000 soldiers dead and almost 300,000 wounded. But this would not be the end of the matter. With Adolf Hitler dead and the leading Nazis fleeing west, the Germans left in Berlin, and in particular the women and girls, would be subjected to some of the most violent and cruel acts imaginable. One major reason for the violence would fester as the Soviet forces pushed the Nazis back. The advancing armies uncovered the true scale of the Nazi crimes against humanity. In the West, General Eisenhower ordered that such gruesome discoveries be recorded for posterity's sake, and that so future generations would have no bias to deny what happened. In the East, the Soviets liberated the most infamous of death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, uncovering evidence of the huge scale of slaughter, including a warehouse of discarded clothing. But Stalin forbade the dissemination amongst the Soviet population of the Holocaust, as he did not want the Jews to be seen as a special victim of Nazi cruelty. Such discoveries instead only added to the messaging against Nazi Germany. The Nazis had violated the Russian motherland, had killed its people, and sought to completely destroy the Soviet Union. In response, any level of cruelty was acceptable in the destruction of the Nazi state. As early as October of 1944, the Soviets were recorded committing violent retribution against German civilians. In Nemesdorf, dozens of civilians and Allied prisoners of war were massacred by Red Army soldiers. Young girls and women were subjected to SA before being murdered. When Nazi forces retook the town and discovered the massacre, it was used as an example of the brutality to expect of the Soviet forces. Another instance took place in Delem. At a convent-run maternity clinic and orphanage, the inhabitants were visited by two groups of Soviet soldiers. The first wave all behaved well, treating the women with respect, but warned of the second wave of troops behind. When the first wave left and were replaced by the second wave, the warning proved unfortunately correct. Nuns, young girls, old women, pregnant women, and mothers who had just given birth were all subjected to vicious assaults. Such violence was well known by the Soviet command. Reports sent to Stalin included one stating, "Many Germans declare that all German women in East Prussia who stayed behind were raped by Red Army soldiers." These reports often detailed that the assaults were committed by gangs of soldiers against young girls and old women. Although some attempted to control the rampaging soldiers, it would never be enough. For example, Marshal Rokossovsky issued Order 006 to direct the feelings of hatred at fighting the enemy on the battlefield rather than against civilians. There are known examples of Soviet commanders executing their soldiers for committing SA, but these are few and far between. The general attitude was that Nazi Germany had violated the Russian motherland, and that as a result, any amount of cruelty against German civilians in turn was justifiable. It was seen as a normal part of the war. Perhaps the most grotesque quote came from a Soviet major who told a British journalist, "Our fellows were so sex-starved that they often raped old women of 60, 70 or even 80, much to these grandmothers' surprise, if not downright delight." But in Berlin, the scale of violence and abuse levelled against German women was on another level. It is widely reported that the first wave of Red Army soldiers would engage in the fighting and move on. It was the subsequent wave that reportedly engaged in much of the violence against civilians. Based on accounts from the city's hospital, anywhere from 95,000 to 130,000 women were victims of SA. It is thought that around 10% of these women would go on to take their own lives as a result of the trauma inflicted. Men and boys who attempted to protect their loved ones from the Soviet soldiers were often killed on the spot. Women and young girls would hide away during the times the Soviet soldiers were most active, only coming out in the early mornings for food and water. During the mornings, the Soviet aggressors were often sleeping off hangovers from the night before. Alcohol played a large part in the level of violence employed. Some women tried to disguise themselves as older women, or tried to make it seem like they were infected with typhus. According to Natalia Jess, a Soviet war correspondent, the Soviet soldiers didn't care about the age of their victims. In a quote she said, "Russian soldiers were raping every German female from 8 to 80. It was an army of rapists." Even political affiliation did not stop the soldiers. Female German communists were not spared. When they welcomed the Red Army soldiers and offered to help them with cooking and washing, they were subjected to the same horrors. As long as there has been war, there has always been the SA of women and girls. No side in any conflict can claim that such assaults did not take place. But the scale inflicted on German women by the Soviet army was on another scale. It is important to note that Polish, Ukrainian, Hungarian, and Soviet women were all victims to the same horrific crime. But German women in particular ended up being seen as a spoil of war, something to be taken. What's more, German women and girls became a vehicle to vent frustrations. Soviet society under Stalin was largely sexually repressed, with all love directed to Stalin and the state. When any level of cruelty was permitted or accepted by Soviet command, it was directed against German civilians. The number of German women and girls assaulted are thought to number 2 million, with a great deal having been subjected to multiple SA at a time. Although the role of the Red Army in defeating Nazi Germany was vital, its crimes against German civilians were little more than an exercise in cruel revenge. Something that should not have occurred at such a huge scale, and seen as acceptable by much of the Soviet command.